Were it true now that my eyes are opened, would that be true? We've got an old story here, one of the best known stories in the Western literature. And you might have noticed that we kind of stopped in the middle, and there's a purpose to that, because we only need the parts so far for what we're going to talk about this morning. One of the things that humans like to do is talk about where did we come from? What made us and how did we get here? And in our contemporary setting, this is a wonderful old story, and we tend to study biology and evolution and understand things in a slightly different way. But I think there's still meaning in this text for us, whether or not we accept it as, quote, exactly what happened. So what is a human being? A living being. And how did we get here? And for that matter, why tell a story? Because this is a story. It's not a scientific textbook or a report from the lab or the field. Why tell it in a story? Well, it turns out that stories are more the way that we remember things and that we explain things to ourselves. Some of us who are trained in sciences or technology may have a more explanatory approach to things, but for the most part, if we're going to remember something, we've heard a story. You know, early on, when this church was forming, almost 100 years ago, there was specifically an interest in understanding the Christian faith in light of the knowledge of our own times. And I think that continues to be the case here. Not that the Christian faith is done and settled forever, but that with all the heritage that we have, religious heritage and historical, ecological and biological, and our own communities, with all of this, we create a story. This, some might say, is a story of paradise, of what it was like before everything went bad. Well, maybe it is and maybe it isn't. I mean, maybe it was never the plan that God would leave the living beings in the garden forever. We just don't know. So, we begin today knowing that we are earthlings together. I just want to talk a little bit about this particular story, because I think it's got some interesting details that we might not usually recognize. This story is telling us about the familiar world of the one who is telling the story. And that familiar world is the world of the small farmers in the hill country of Palestine, in the area around Jerusalem and up into Galilee. These are the stories that talk about how we live, how we practice agriculture, how we meet our needs. And it was indeed difficult work. It was work that took all that they could give. This was what they called dry land farming. They didn't have a big river for irrigation purposes. They counted on the winter rains, the fall, winter, spring rains, and on planting their crops in the right places where they could take most advantage of that rain. And also, most advantage of the best agricultural soil, which was called Adamah. And this was a reddish soil, the most fertile in the area. And this is the soil that, in the story, God forms not only human beings, but all the living beings from this soil. So God forms an Adam, and in fact, we don't quite know what this Adam is until much later in the story, other than it's a living being fashioned by God, breathed life by God. But we find out that this being is alone. God says it's not good. And this is really very unusual for God to say that something is not good, something that God has created. But this is not good to be alone. And so God creates from the same soil multiple living beings, seeking a companion, a helper for this Adam, for this living being. And if we read deeply into the Hebrew, we would see that mostly what we're talking about here is domestic animals, cattle and sheep and goats, oxen, donkeys, animals that assist humans in agriculture and in supplying all their needs. And even so, none of them is quite the suitable helper that God is talking about creating. And so God creates a second being, living being, from the Adam, same bones, same flesh, same soil, a suitable helper. And you may have heard that this story is the one that proves that woman is subservient to man, because woman was made from man, and woman is a helper. Well, that's a little bit awkward, because the most frequent use of this word helper in Hebrew is referring to God and to humans asking God for help. So this is not the idea of subservience here, and there's no indication in this passage that subservience is the way. But it's also been used to say, I won't say it aloud, but you've heard the phrase, God made Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. Well, I did say it aloud. And this is, what's interesting is this story was not told to prove who should marry. This story was told to show who's here and how did they get here. So I'm going to leave it at that. We don't need to trouble ourselves too much over that. But one thing I think is really important here is that the beings in this story are all created from earth. They are all earthlings. They are all beings who not only come from the earth and depend on the earth and all that it can produce, but will return to the earth when their lives have ended. And there's a certain humility to that recognition. There's a certain understanding of limits for human beings. We may or may not think those limits are appropriate today. Are we truly limited to earth? Well, as you may have heard me say before, I'm very interested in ecological concerns and the sustainability of life, not only human lives, but of all lives. And I'm interested in how we all live together and how we care for each other. But there's a line of thought in our world today, one that I had scarcely paid attention to before this week, before accidentally encountering it. But there's a bundle of what might be called ideologies. So we have here a story that creates a certain worldview, a certain understanding of the world. But there's this new bundle of ideologies developed over the last 30, 40 years. It began with what was called transhumanism. And this was the idea that as humans, we could improve ourselves by connecting ourselves to technology. We might be able to think faster or whatever. That we would become a radically enhanced species, a post-human species. And there was this idea that we could engineer paradise. And this was seen as a parallel to religion, as a secular replacement for religion. And this idea has been enhanced itself by multiple other words. I'm going to read a few of them to you, but I'm not going to try to explain them because my point is not that we need to understand them, but that these are all versions of understanding that humans could and indeed should be more than the simple human beings we are. So we have extropianism, singularitarianism, cosmism, rationalism, effective altruism, long-termism, and all of these terms have come to be connected. Now, we might think that those last two, effective altruism and long-termism, sound like they make sense. They do. I mean, one of the concerns that we have about so much of what happens in our culture and our economy and our technology today is that it's created with only the short view in mind, without considering what is going to happen next year or in the next decade or the next generation or indeed even 100 years from now. But this long-termism has come to have another meaning. And this other meaning comes out of this tradition of what's called effective altruism. Now, effective altruism emerges from an idea that in order to live in the most moral, the most ethical way, that we should create the most good possible. And this comes directly out of a certain strand of ethical thinking in the Western canon called utilitarianism, which says that the way to choose the right thing to do is to look for the greatest balance of the positive over the negative. So this idea of effective altruism became very popular among the transhumanists and their cohorts, many of whom are in the world of computer science. And it became that because it was something that you could measure. Now, many of us, when we think of ethics and morals, we think not only of measuring what's right and what's wrong, but we think about what is the impact on the human being, on all human beings. How does this affect us as human beings? And we think of ourselves as human beings not only as rational thinkers, but as beings of body, of emotion, of spirit. And this mode of thinking sort of excludes the body and the emotions and spirit as important and focuses on what they understand as logical or rational thinking. So this idea of effective altruism grows, and along with this idea of transhumanism, and this idea has developed that the more good that we create, the more that we can serve humans, the more humans there are. The more humans there are, the better. And the more good we can create for them, the better. It sounds good. But what happens is they develop this idea that, well, the earth will indeed become uninhabitable. And so we will need to go to space. And in order to do this, we are going to need not only to enhance ourselves digitally, but to transform ourselves to digital beings. And that by transforming ourselves to digital beings, we can create so many more of us that the number of humans alive today counts for almost nothing. So we should put our effort not into caring for those who are here today. Well, maybe a little bit, but mostly we should focus on creating an artificial intelligence, a general artificial intelligence, one that can carry on all the understandings of human logic and use that intelligence to create more and more of us. We'll become little beings existing within a large bank of computer and memory. You might be able to guess that this is a very odd way of thinking to me. I do understand that this gift of this earth, life, breath, being part of this order of being with all the animals and all the plants and all the microbes, this is human life to me. But this group of long-termists who see long-term not in terms of thousands or even millions of years, but billions of years out into the whole universe, spreading ourselves as digital beings. This long-termism is a different point of view, and it seeks to fill what they call a religious or a religion-shaped hole. That because somehow our religious traditions have become irrelevant, that there's still something in us that looks for a greater purpose, a larger reason for being, something larger to be part of. And so the imagination is that this is what they will create. Well, I need not tell you that there are some problems with this idea, and I'm just going to begin with one of them. You may have heard the story of Timnit Gebru, who was an ethicist of artificial intelligence at Google. And several years ago, she and another author had written an article, a research article, that looked at what they called algorithmic bias. So all these computer systems that pretend they're intelligent for us have taken massive amounts of data and used that data to construct a system of logic. And that system of logic then tells us how things should be. And what Gebru pointed out with her author Emil Torres was that these algorithms assumed that all the data that came to them was correct and complete. And so the data was mostly about the goodness of white people and the evil of people of color, that their neighborhoods are dangerous, that their behavior is suspect, and so on. We've seen this play out in some of the law enforcement algorithms that are being used to predict who is going to commit a crime. And because she didn't want to withdraw the paper, Gebru was fired from Google. And she herself is an Ethiopian American, so she has experienced the kind of racism that she is arguing that the algorithms the computers are currently operating ignore. But this was not, Google claimed that she had not looked at the latest research. And so we have this challenge to ourselves. We have many people in this high-tech world, some of whose names we know, who invest billions of dollars in the pursuit of this artificial intelligence that will eventually get us to outer space. One of these billionaires is currently trying to get to space with their own rockets, and so on. Because they say we must do that. This is the only way to the future, to become digital ourselves and to be prepared to leave the earth. I'm going to argue, in part on the basis of the biblical text, yes, that we are created from earth, that we are earthlings, that we are earth beings, that we share in common with all the beings of the earth, the most primal basis of life. And I'm going to argue that this is demonstrated not only through our ancient biblical stories, but through much of our contemporary science, whether it be in ecology or biology or natural history or climate science or oceanography, or all the many ways that the very diverse community of science researchers, brain researchers, of psychologists and sociologists and anthropologists, of artists, of musicians, of creative writers of all kinds, that while we may enjoy an occasional science fiction novel that helps us imagine another way we might live on Earth, that in fact we are Earth beings. And that is what we are called to be, Earth beings. Earth beings who are partners and helpers in life to each other, to all of each other, that we are not only related one-to-one in a biological way, but on the fundamental level of our being, of our physiology, of our brains, of our hearts, of our souls. So I'm going to argue that humility and limit, these are still guiding principles that might help us decide what is a moral way to live, what is an ethical way to live. Might we not value justice over the magnitude of digital human beings who might someday populate the universe? Might we not value a greater degree of equality than one that says a very special group of people will determine the future for the whole human race and launch their vision of the future? Might we not say that our Christian tradition invites us not only to study the teachings of our own tradition, but indeed the teachings of all the ethical traditions of the world? I think so. So, earthlings, living beings, people of the soil, let us celebrate this very biological being that we share, this very social being that we share, this very spiritual being that we share. Because this, I say, is life. This is life. This is life.